Hello and welcome to the CLB Forge podcast. This is a show to help equip you and your church for mission, ministry, and making disciples. I'm Ryan Nilsson.
And I am Mike Natal, and we made it to the silver anniversary edition episode. This is episode 25. We have a great guest today, only appropriate that we pick him for our 25th episode. So let me introduce you to him. Jon grew up in Central Florida. His life picked up a lot more in his teenage years when he decided to work every summer at Tuscarora Inn and Conference Center, live in that Laurel Longhouse, may it rest in peace, and meet one of the largest influences in his life, one of the coolest people that he has since met, other than the other person that I'm going to mention in a little bit. And of course, it was me. Jon and I did a lot of, we'll call them shenanigans and antics, none of which we can get into right now because we might get arrested for them.
Yeah, we're laying low from the law.
It's interesting that after you mentioned a building that you lived in, and after you lived in it, they had to tear it down.
That is a coincidence of which we are probably one of the many reasons. Okay. Not to mention the fact that Paul DeQuatro bucked somebody through one of the walls. But we won't go there. Needless to say, we're going to keep talking about Jon for a little bit. So here we go. He graduated with a bachelor's and a master's from UCF, which is the University of Central Florida, in mechanical engineering. He currently lives in Boston, and he works at General Electric designing jet engines. To quote one of my favorite movies, my boy is wicked smart. All right? And ladies, I'm sorry to let you know this, but before you swoon any harder, Jon is a happily married man to the love of his life, the lovely Elizabeth. They currently attend City Life Presbyterian Church in Boston. Ladies and gentlemen, give a hearty, warm welcome to Jonathan Heppner. We're happy to have you here, Jon.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. So happy to be here. It's, I'm glad you guys made it 25 episodes, because I'll probably say something that'll just get this whole thing shut down. So, good work.
Well,
thus
maybe
far.
You want to weigh into the controversy that's slowly destroying our show?
Sure.
What do you think is better, Star Trek or Star Wars? We want you on the record.
Yeah. I think, again, hard. I like both worlds. I'm not going to lie. I'm firmly in the middle here. And I think if I was going to live in one universe, it would probably be the Star Trek universe. I'm much more interested in, I think the day-to-day life is a little more fleshed out there. But if I need to spend 2.5 hours on a Friday night watching a movie, it's going to be Star Wars. So, I think I'm probably going to lean slightly left of center there on Star Wars. I don't know which way those two go, but Star Wars is probably a little more in the cockles of my heart than Star Trek.
That's spoken with great eloquence and diplomatic tact, spoken like a rocket scientist who is moving through the ranks of management at GE. That's I get it
something
now.
Like that.
Good answer.
Right.
We both found something to like.
Your
answer. That was good.
Well, I
just liked it
both
more.
of you on it. Yeah, naturally. I think it's because I think Ryan is significantly more mature than you are, Mike. And I think if I went the other way, it would just devastate you. And Ryan's a little more capable of bouncing back from that.
You are absolutely correct. And you know what? Regardless, I'm taking that.
Sure. Hey, a win's a win.
Yeah.
Right.
And that was a great introduction, Mike. And
thanks.
In addition to this great friendship that you two have, Jon and I, we should full disclosure, we're cousins. So we are part of the same family, and
I would like to let people know, let the record state for this particular situation, relationship far trumps relative.
Oh, you think so?
At least in my opinion, at this moment right now, until it changes in my benefit, and I'll change it.
Right.
Okay.
So
okay. Yeah. Well, with that, let's get on with our show. Jon, we're really excited to talk with you today because of your experiences growing up. And we're going to get into that in this show as we talk about what churches can do to bless the PKs in their church. What things that PKs need from lay leaders.
So this isn't a mechanical engineering podcast, is what I'm gathering.
That's just what we told you to get you on the show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So all those questions that I prepared about like fuel lines and stuff, I should just scrap those now, or
it was all a ruse.
Yep.
I spent so much time preparing, and we're talking about PK.
Yeah, we're not talking about combustion chambers. So, and we're going to try and work in. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to jokes about 10 of those throughout the show.
Right.
So, can you start off by telling us a little bit about your spiritual journey? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell someone about your spiritual journey. Can you do that?
If anything, the rocket science is a hindrance to my spiritual. No, I'd be happy to. I grew up in the church. Kind of as you alluded to, and we'll kind of define PK later. Pastor's kid. My dad was and continues to be a pastor. He's actually out in Montana right now, pastoring a church in Billings. And so I grew up there. I think it's one of those things where I don't know a moment in my life when I wasn't, I wouldn't consider myself a Christian, right? It's kind of like I came into conscious thought firmly in the Christian camp, which has its pros and cons, but, grew up in the church, remember a lot of Sunday school, VBS, junior week at Tuscarora events that really set a nice foundation on my spiritual walk. And there's certainly a lot of ups and downs. And then that walk, I think, got really cemented in college. There's some things that maybe we'll get into. Like I said, a lot of ups and a lot of downs, and kind of came into college on the maybe even more seeking than I thought I would be as someone who, had been, I would say, saved very young and affirmed and confirmed in that faith throughout the years of my life. And then, came into college and became very active in Campus Crusade all throughout school. And actually, Mike mentioned I got a master's degree, and part of that decision to continue schooling at UCF was my involvement with Campus Crusade. I was discipled by the director, a guy named Pez, who is just a wonderful, godly man, and showed me a lot of things, and we built a ministry there for college students, I think, that I'm really proud of, and it became a bedrock as well in my faith journey. And so, came through Crusade and really, I think, became bolstered there, and then found myself in Boston after college, and have been to a couple of churches, but have settled into city life, and I think that's been a big part of my journey too, is to see things grow up over time. And I really, I think I've seen the bright and the dark side of the church, at least in my experience, and have come through it. And I'm really happy to say that I think I've found God and Christ in some of those darker places, and has kept me around, which has been wonderful. But yeah, so, grew up really firmly ensconced in the church, have seen some things, coming up through my adolescence that I would say, kind of maybe pushed me away from God, and then kind of found him again in college. And all along that, there have been some wonderful, youth leaders that have really sheltered me and shown me a lot of great things. And then, like I said, just coming through, working at Tuscarora has been a really highlight of my life. Mike said it maybe in jest, but it is true that those years were really valuable to me, to be in a community of believers working, towards an end that really helped. And then just coming through college, and now that I'm in Boston, I think my focus has shifted, and now that I'm in a church with, some, I would say I spent a lot of time in Crusade and Parachurch ministries, in my early years, where I found myself to be some of the older people in the room. And so now I'm going to a church in Boston that has, a really nice, I don't know, just a panoply of people throughout different generations. And I've found some people with some experience that really helped minister into my life. And I'm really enjoying that. So yeah, I think my faith journey has been a bumpy one, but we made it thus far. I recently got married. You mentioned my beautiful wife, Elizabeth. We got married literally the day before the pandemic. And that's been an adventure for sure. But, she's been a big influence on my spiritual life as well. So just there's a lot there. And I don't know if you want to unpack any of it, but it's been quite the ride. And I think journey is absolutely the right word.
Yeah, that's tremendous. And I've been happy to be along with you on that journey for sure, through great times and bumpy times and rocky times. And the Lord has been faithful through it all. And so that's really important to kind of put that in perspective. Also, for those of you who don't know, Jon, when I first came out here and started serving at Faith, Jon actually filled the pulpit quite a few times for me so that I could get away and have some vacation time. So I'm grateful for that too. And I've seen Jon blossom too in sermon writing, just as he's continued forward. So hopefully you continue to do that and continue to formulate, God's word in a succinct way as you continue to minister. And as God continues to use you, just because you work at GE and you're designing jet engines, you can still use that to glorify God. And I feel like that's exactly what you're doing up there in Boston. And I'm really encouraged to see all that you're using all your skills to really let God shine through you, man, which is great.
Thanks.
So, all right, on to, before we get all sappy and we start crying and stuff, let's talk about this PK thing. So here, I'll lob you one that, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the answer to this question. What is a PK, Jon?
Yeah, I think it's pretty, penalty kicks in soccer are important. No, pastor's kid, and it's a nice, non-gender specific. So, just any child of a pastor, adopted or natural, I suppose. But, just a kid growing up in a household that's primary vocation is ministering the gospel of Jesus Christ.
So as a PK, Jon, can you how many churches have you been a part of being a PK?
Sure. I guess I'll count the ones now because I was in Montana actually just this past weekend visiting my parents, and as you guys do, got asked to read scripture. So, the bench was a little thin, and I was crying sermon illustrations. So there's no rest for the wicked, I'm afraid.
You keep trying to get away, and they keep pulling you back in.
They just really. So when I was born, my dad was pastoring at Stavanger Church just outside of Fergus. So that's one. And then the second one would be Bethany Lutheran Brethren in Staten Island. Gethsemane in Rochester is 3. We planted Jordan Valley Community Church in Pennsylvania would be 4. Sunshine LB Church in Holiday would be 5. Am I counting correctly? And then Malta, Elam Lutheran Brethren Church up in Malta, Montana, and now my dad's at Pilgrim Community Church in Billings, Montana. So I think that's 6 in total.
Nope, try again.
7, but it's okay. You're an engineer. We know you don't need math a lot.
Well, it's because I got to talk to other people. It's throwing me off my game. Usually we just sit and stare at the wall all day.
Fair enough.
All right, cool. So growing up through that, what were some of the greatest things about being a PK?
Yeah, I think just having parents so firmly rooted in the gospel is huge. I grew up in such a loving, grace-filled household that, I have nothing bad to say about how my parents brought us up, and I think that was wonderful. And being a part of so many churches, just a lot of really cool people. And I think the pastoral one is very much a relational occupation and ministry, and then just being in the center of those relationships and learning that from my parents, and just seeing that work was great. I mentioned that, there was a lot of ups and downs, but, from the ups and now that I'm an adult looking back, just feeling, I was definitely just brought up in such a great space with some very loving people. So I feel very fortunate. So yeah, definitely, having parents that were so focused on the gospel and, I definitely, don't get me wrong, based on our shenanigans together, Mike, I need a lot of discipline along the way. So there's that too. But, having some just parents with their head in their shoulders was wonderful. And then, yeah, definitely the friendships and the relationships I made along the way as I, grew up in the church and really just feel that, coming to this side of my childhood and adolescence, very blessed to be a part of that. Just a lot of really great people and experiences along the way, just being a part of, 75 VBSs a summer across the city of New York, was a lot of fun. Having that constant flurry of activity and people around. I'm 100% extroverted. I think, Mike, you and I might actually duke it out for, most extroverted person in the world title. We're pretty close in that respect, but that was just heaven to me, was having so many things to do. I remember sitting up in my bedroom. The parsonage in Staten Island, New York, was across the parking lot from the church, and watching the youth group there, and just feeling so. I was sad as a 4-year-old because I couldn't go hang out with them, but just having that presence in my life
Awesome.
and having a million older brothers and sisters, was really great, and really just felt very loved by the church, and just came up in some really fun environment.
Nice. So now let's ask the opposite question. What were some of the difficulties that came up with being a pastor's kid?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there are 7 churches, that I've been a part of in my 34 years of life, and honestly, 5 of those came before I was 20, and so we moved around quite a lot. That definitely, again, growing up and looking back, I don't ever regret things so much, because who's to say how I would have, come about, if things were different. I feel very fortunate to be the person who I am with the family that I have, but I'm not going to say it wasn't hard. We started new churches, we moved, I think, every 3 or 4 years on average while I was growing up. Between my 5th and 10th grade year, I started a new school every year. And so that was hard. And then, being a pastor's kid, and maybe this is unique to my experience, maybe not, but I think that being such a relationship-driven job, there's the good and the bad, right? So when things are good, I'm experiencing the joy and the wonder of the gospel doing great things. But when those relationships sour, or when things are hard, or when discipline is happening, I'm also experiencing kind of full blast of that too. I'm the oldest, so that was, I think, a lot of expectations kind of fell to me, whether perceived or real. Definitely, I think, wound its way into my head and is hard. And I think it's tough when your dad or your mom, however your parents are involved in ministry, when their primary source of income, is dependent on a church. It gets really stressful, and it can be hard to really enjoy, the worship and the corporate fellowship, because, it's like, if, like I said, if these relationships sour, then our income is going to sour along with it. And I definitely felt that as a kid, especially as I was growing older, and growing up and kind of coming into that, a lot of those ministry experiences, were tied to planting a new church where, there is nothing, and you're kind of building something from scratch and experiencing the stress of that. I think my parents do a good job of creating a divide between, them and us, but, that stuff just flows down. There's no there's no keeping that back. So
just to clarify,
sure.
by divide, you mean more along the lines of setting boundaries, right?
Yeah. Setting
Okay.
boundaries.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So tell me what you think about this, John. I mean, I've heard, a great way to kind of explain to someone who's maybe not a pastor, or even helps pastors understand what they're going through, is most people, their support system in life is like a three-legged stool.
Mm-hmm.
And they're largely different groups of people. There's work. Why am I having such a hard time holding up my fingers in front of the camera? There's work, there is your spiritual community, and there's your family.
Right.
And for most people, those are different groups of people. And so if you have a problem in one area, the other two areas are there to support you and kind of hold you up. Like if you're having trouble at work, your spiritual community, your family, they're there for you. The challenge with pastors is that it's a one-legged stool.
Right.
Family, spiritual community, their employment are all enmeshed.
Yeah.
And so it makes any kind of challenge or crisis really very stressful and can be traumatic too. So does that kind of resonate with your experiences?
100%. Yeah. No, I was going to mention this too, and it is less of a traumatic thing, but just like when I got out of the house and entered college, it was really hard for me to find a church because I never had to do that before. We never church hopped as a child, you go to the, like there was no choices. Like I attended a youth group with a buddy from high school just because it was another thing to do to fill a Thursday night or whatever. But like to show up in college and be like, how do I think about this? Or how do I want to pursue, a spiritual community in a town that doesn't have maybe the brand of Christianity I grew up with? How do I make informed decisions on the church in that way? So that was really interesting and really, less difficult, but more of like a new experience for me. I think that's exactly right. Your family attends the same church that you work at, all of those legs. If not one leg, you've got a stool with three legs very close together, and it's a lot easier to stress that or tip it, for sure.
Yeah.
How has it affected you, being a part of a church as an adult, as an independent adult with your own family now?
I've had to work really hard, and my wife will tell you this. I say it fairly often, but like I've often, I think, assumed too much responsibility or given too much of my time and effort too quickly, and run a very serious risk for burnout. Because my only relationship with the church is do whatever you have to do. Give as much as you can, just because. Like I said, we planted a church where, we made 70 pounds of lasagna for a dinner and no one showed up for it. Right. Like, so, oftentimes, it feels like the pastor's family is sometimes some of the only people who get, volunteered or voluntold to do things. And so, when I enter church, I have to be really careful to kind of set up some very strict boundaries. And so like the City Life Presbyterian Church is a church I've begun attending because I've gotten married and we've decided to go to my wife's church. And I've kind of told her that I'm going to wait at least a year before I, start volunteering or serving, just to kind of give it some time for my life to settle in and relax into maybe a healthier way to be a member of the body.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great. It's healthy.
Yeah,
for sure.
The theme of our show today is what your PKs need from your church. And there's two audience groups that we want to connect with. And one is the lay people in the church, but the other one is the pastors. So John, if you had a room full of pastors with young kids who are beginning their families or raising their kids, and what kind of tips, what kind of advice would you give to those parents? If those parents were around you and just said, John, having grown up as a PK, what's some advice, maybe from some of the positive experiences, maybe from some of the challenges that you faced?
Yeah, I think, man, that's great.
No pressure.
Love that thought.
Loaded.
Yeah, I mean, just the souls of thousands of children are now squarely in my hands. But,
no pressure.
No, seriously. I think that, it's not too different than what I've kind of learned the hard way myself. Is just that, like, for pastors, like boundaries are important. really knowing when to bring, kids into what's going on at the church. And like I said, like some of that trickles down and you can't keep it out, but really boundaries and or just being very honest, with kids in a way that they understand. And, like maybe a teenager is a little better for, understanding some of the hard things that are going on in a church and what's going on than a younger kid. But I think just trying to remember that, like just because you signed up for, because your income is coming from the church, like your kids didn't sign up for that, and just, I'm not going to say that your kids shouldn't be a part of your church, right? That's ridiculous. But just, kind of trying to remember that those, like, your wife and your kids necessarily aren't on the payroll of the church, and putting up some boundaries there too. And I think that flows out too, when, like I said, a lot of expectations, came from that, like, that I would be a willing set of hands, and I often am, but maybe just keep an eye on your kids to see if they're getting burnt out from being involved. Like I said, I went to a different VBS every week of the summer. And some of that was probably for my parents' sanity, which, God knows they needed, but also just like understanding that, like, a little space from a little break from that world isn't a bad thing either. And it's good to see, I think, pastors find, vacation and the hobbies and time away from the church that, that this is healthy, for them and their families. I think like time constraints are tough. It was really hard for me, coming into a 9-to-5, 40-hour a week job, because that's not the way our life was structured when I was a kid. And so just maybe realizing that, when, like, just, I get it that, like, things are happening and you're dealing with spiritual catastrophes day and night, but, that has an impact on your family. And also, like, maybe spend some time with your kids as they, kind of come into adulthood, to help them understand how, like, if they're not going to go into a less time consistent ministry as an occupation, like, what does a job look like, and how does, a 9-to-5, regular schedule look? Because that was really difficult for me to kind of like absorb into my life, because just had never had to do that before. So I think, I think the pastors out there are doing a great job, with their kids, but definitely I think it's smart to remember too that, like, I don't know, I this may be extremely arrogant, but that's kind of my MO. But I've seen a lot of pastors' kids fall into one of two traps. Either they just reject the gospel, because they've been burned by the relationships and the ministries of the church, and just walk away, which is not what anybody wants. Or maybe they dive headfirst into a calling or a ministry that not necessarily for them. I definitely felt a lot of pressure growing up, and still feel it, that, like, maybe I'm, set apart for a, occupational ministry myself. And I'm not saying that's not on the horizon somewhere, but it definitely, if I had a nickel for every time someone was like, when are you going to seminary? When is your turn? I think, I'd have a lot more money than I do right now. And that was a consistent, consistent theme in my life growing up.
Yeah. So some of that's from you've got some great gifts. So some people may be asking you because of that, but it sounds like probably there were also people asking that because of your family of origin.
Yeah.
Ergo, you'll become a pastor.
Yeah. And I say that's an arrogant thought, more because I don't think I've encountered one of those two spaces. I'm still very happy to be a part of the church, and very firmly emplaced in my beliefs of the gospel. But I also have, did I think about joining going to seminary and joining ministry? Sure. But I didn't really ever feel that calling to do that, and have kind of resisted maybe, following down a path that isn't for me, just because it's something my dad did, or that's people are telling me that's what I should be doing. So yeah, I think that, like, certainly, you want to encourage gifts where you see it, but, just because a kid, spends all of his time at a church because his dad works there and he basically lives there, doesn't mean he needs to work there for the rest of his life either.
Right. And I think that That's where discipleship comes in too. Is that it's not just the role of the pastor to be the one who is doing the discipling. It's not just the role of him to bring people in, or even other people to bring people in and then have the pastor like swoop in and start to disciple them.
Yeah.
But the role of the church in general is to make disciples. And so, Jon, and I've encouraged you of this before, I think no matter what you do, your passion for the gospel, God's going to use that to disciple other people, whether you're an engineer, whether you're working at GE, whether you're, the rock star that you wanted to be when you were at Tuscarora, any of that, God is capable of taking and using in order to further his kingdom. So I think that that's really important too, to point out to people is you don't have to be a pastor to start discipling, and you don't have to go to seminary in order to share the gospel with people. You can do that in what your current vocation.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to think about. Like you said, Ryan, I certainly have found myself with some gifts that lend themselves in that way. And I'm also extremely extroverted and not afraid of the limelight, as you two well know. But, not every kid is like that, and I think that, it doesn't hurt me too much to be the front and center of every Christmas pageant, but, that's not maybe like for everyone, like some of my siblings certainly are much more introverted than I am and shy away from that stuff. And I can totally see, either, they could be thrust in a spotlight that they're not comfortable for, or our relationship could be, different. And maybe that's something to realize too, for the church body and some of your lay leaders, is that like kids are different, and it's really easy to kind of lump us all into one, space that, just because, Jon comes out and he likes being in front of the spotlight and all that stuff doesn't mean that his siblings do either. Mm-hmm. Right. So I think it's just being aware of, the pastor's kids are not the pastor.
Yeah, that's a great segue into our last question too. Exactly what you're talking about right here. So Ryan kind of took the side of, pastors in terms of raising your kids. What should you be aware of? So now my question is, what advice, Jon, could you give to like lay people on how they can be a blessing to the pastor's kids, or even like how they deal with them too? Like that's another important thing as well. So can you speak into that?
I mean, maybe do's and don'ts,
Sure.
any of those. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say, like do disciple, your pastor's kids, in a healthy way. Yeah. I would say maybe don't do that without building a relationship with them as a person. I think a lot of times, you get, like your interactions with someone, if they're only limited to an hour on Sundays and an hour on Wednesday nights or whatever, it's really easy to be like, hey, you need this, and you like to be very instructive. But I would say, like, if you're going to do that, maybe take the time to invest in them outside of the church, and get to know them as a person. Just because I love the church and I've come up through it, but like I have more dimensions, than that, and I think it's really hard to have a discipling relationship if you don't have common ground outside of that. Like, it kind of rings a little hollow. And like I said, I definitely a big don't, is, like I said, expecting them to be the number one volunteer for every little thing you're doing, or the lead in your pageant or whatever.
Or never get in trouble in any way, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I'm constantly in trouble to this day. I'm just perpetually in trouble, and it is stressful. It's stressful because not only do you have that, like your parents, have, like you said, like the legs of your stool are so close together as a child that, like, I don't know, like I think that I was either told or perceived this idea that, like, oh, well, like we have to be held to a higher standard because we're, and I think, sure, Paul certainly talks about that and being above reproach and all that stuff. But again, like it just helps to remember that like the pastor's kids haven't gotten there yet, like they have not been called, to living a life, like that. And sure, I would love to say that we're all called to high standards, but like I think something that your kids need as lay leaders is just a ton of grace, and a ton of understanding that, like they are going through the throes of life in a very public place, especially, for an hour every Sunday, like you're associated with the one person everyone's looking to for advice, so it's definitely very easy, I think, to scar and hurt kids in the pastoral ministry from this, these unrealistic, lofty expectations, or just publicizing, who they are and what they're doing in a public way. I would caution. Sorry if I'm jumping around on you, but I kind of made a joke about this, but I think it would be wise to like get permission from your kids if you're ever going to use them as a sermon illustration, because that happens to me constantly. And again, I'm pretty happy to shrug it off a lot, but it is, it's just, it can be hard, like that's your business. That's kind of getting aired in front of 100 people or more. And, it can be traumatizing.
Yeah. Jon, thanks so much for your insight in this. It's great. And I think that it's something that, for the most part, doesn't really get talked about that often.
Yeah, so. I think you're right. Like I said, I think that like, when you candidate or when you, take a job as a pastor, oftentimes your family's also being evaluated as part of that package. Mm-hmm. When like I go to work at GE, they're not asking my wife how willing she is to throw a potluck for the staff, every couple of weeks or whatever, and I mean, that's an overgeneralization for sure. But I think it's just can be really hard on a family to shoulder some of the burdens of a ministry lifestyle that, a married couple is going to go into that with their eyes wide open, but your kids have to figure that out kind of through trial and error as they grow up.
Yeah.
Jon, I'm curious to know a couple of things that I think about on this topic. Like one piece of advice I would give to lay people in the church is don't treat PKs different from other kids.
Absolutely.
So when someone in my church would say something like to one of my kids, like, well, people are looking up to you because you're a pastor's kid.
Right.
That I would ask them not to say things like that.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the dangerous things is to rate, kind of like what you were saying, that you hold those kids to a higher expectation because their father's in vocational ministry.
Right.
Like.
I think that sword has two edges. Too.
Completely disconnected. They're not. Yeah. They're not connected, and yet we often make some kind of parallel between those two things.
Right. Well, so your kid is either gonna, be stressed out because they're, being held as an example, or they're going to become overly confident. And I'm suppose you can guess which way those seeds grew up in my life. But,
I'm sure we could ask Elizabeth about that, right?
You probably
yeah. All right.
I think
or the siblings.
You're either going to puff those kids up to think that they're supernaturally good, or you're going to set them up to be torn down later when they don't live up to whatever expectation you're holding for them.
Yeah.
No, one thing I loved about the last church I served is they just treated my kids like anybody else's, and they were great at that. And so my kids, had they thought of being a PK as a very positive thing. And man, I was just so thankful and relieved to know that's how they felt about that. Like,
and I definitely came through that. Like I said, I don't regret becoming a PK. I think it was hard, and there are some hard things that come along with it. And that's a lot of that is just my personal, experience with, some ministries, when I was a freshman in college, my father and the church he was serving parted ways in a pretty ugly way. And that was hard for me. It took me a couple of years to get back on board with, organized social religion. I don't think I really ever really truly walked away from my faith, but it took a long time for me to start trusting people, with my ins and outs, just because, like I said, that relationship is so key to, like the relationship between a pastor and his elder board, or a pastor and a church is so, intrinsic to that job and the worth you derive from it. If that ends poorly, it just really sends shockwaves, through a family. Yeah. And like I said, I have siblings that I know either were very hurt and scarred. And I think, will have long lasting effects that impact their whole life as far as them in the church. So it's tough.
Which too, that when you think about it, in the realm of situations like that occurring, if it was outside of the church, people would feel defensive and they would be upset and they would be hurt. But a lot of times, it's definitely a difficult situation. But to kind of bring it back around, I think knowing your mom and your dad and your siblings, what really rooted your family was the gospel, man. Through and through, the gospel is proclaimed in that Heppner house fairly often, which is the glue that's needed in order to pull things together and pull things off, and to really have a productive ministry family, which, whether you want it to be or not, that's what you get when you go into ministry. So I think realistically, like, people just need to realize that the gospel is going to transcend a lot of this stuff. And unless you are making sure that you put it as the premier thing in your family, difficulties are going to happen. And realistically, the way through those difficulties is the reminder of what Christ did on the cross. And I think that's really important. So,
yeah, I think as a pastor and as a family, like, the closest people to me on this planet, aside from my wife, are Mike Natal is number 2. And then 3 through 7 are the 6 members of the Heppner household. Like that, we just had such a really strong family. And I think that's important, to really, I don't know, like to just promote that core, like you said, the legs of your stool are so close together, they have to be strong. And, it's just, looking back, it's just really, I thank God every day for, the relationships inside my own family that really helped pull me through all that.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
I was wondering, John, there's a couple of thoughts I have too about how a pastor's family is engaged by the rest of the church. And there's a couple things that can happen. Like one thing I've seen happen sometimes with families is that, people in the church. So if I was giving advice to lay people, one piece I would say is, like, don't expect every member of the pastor's family to become your friend, or that they're obligated to, because we all have different ways of selecting friends. And I think sometimes people can become offended if they don't click and become fast friends.
Yeah. Because
they're part of the same church and this person's a member of the pastor's family. It doesn't mean that you will automatically develop this amazing friendship. Now, I mean, at a really deep level. And the other thing too, I think that can happen sometimes, is that the pastor and their family are excluded from the personal lives of the families in the church. And you talked about that earlier. Like sometimes pastor's family doesn't get invited to any, the big, like the big Thanksgiving service or Christmas service happens. Yeah. And then everyone goes to their big family gatherings, but the pastor and family, they go home by themselves and no one's invited them to join their bigger family gatherings. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of a, 2 kind of related things there. Yeah. Any more thoughts on those kinds of issues?
Yeah. I think it's just being sensitive to that, I think, cause that can go both ways, right? Yeah. Either, I know in our house, we've done both, right? Like we've been invited to friends in the church for Thanksgiving, and it's been great. But I think in other ways, like we're oftentimes like just kind of need to crash. Like, it's
Yeah. Yep. So
as an adult.
If we could put it a different way, like maybe I could say more succinctly, like lay people in your church, invite your pastor's family to stuff.
Right.
Don't be upset if they say no.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's just the sensitivity there to kind of read that both ways, that both are valid. And it's we took a lot of vacations on like off times just because, like we can't go away for Christmas or, Easter or Thanksgiving and all that stuff just because of the rhythm of the church. And so, but yeah, I think, it can be hard, you miss out on times with family. And so I think it's great to make your pastor feel welcome in your home, and then also just respecting that if he doesn't need that.
Yeah. Well said.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
One last thing I was thinking about too, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, but I think it's always wise, having raised PKs, to try not to talk about church people or church problems in front of the kids.
Mm-hmm.
Right. To really, especially when you're in those really difficult seasons, I think that can affect your kids more than most other, challenges that come your way. Any thoughts on that, John?
Yeah, I think, something I alluded to earlier is that, like just having that kind of that separation of, like you said, not church and state, but like family and work, if you and your spouse are working through some hard things in the church, like, if possible, try to shelter your children from that a little bit, especially if they're really young, right? Because it's hard to make sense of some of those more complicated things as a young person, as a child, and even as an adolescent too. So yeah, I would encourage you to try to keep that, I don't want to say like, sugarcoat the way life is or shelter your children. I certainly don't affirm that behavior, but just also knowing that like a child is not going to understand, why that person and you are not seeing eye to eye, and why they're saying terrible things about you or vice versa. And yeah, I think it's like I said, I felt that as an adolescent, certainly as I was coming maybe a little more into abstract thought and feeling like, is this going to affect our ability to pay bills and put food on the table? And, like, are you going to be in trouble? Are we going to have to go to another church with the move again? Like some of those things like that trauma is real in my life. And it's really easy to pass it along to kids that don't understand what's going on.
Yeah. I think if, thank you. Cause I think, you may be, if you're a pastor and you're talking about a church problem or people you're frustrated with, you may resent a person because of that, but your kids hearing it, they may resent God and the faith that you're raising them in. Yeah. The church in general can really, And I also think too, it's good for lay people to not, if they are frustrated with their pastor, to not let the PKs hear any hint of that.
Yeah, I would certainly say like taking it out on the PKs would be wildly inappropriate. So definitely don't do that.
But it happens.
But yeah, absolutely.
Totally
and then
happens.
Also, I think that like, like that separation needs to exist too, just because like you said, or like, like we've talked about that, the PK is not the pastor, and so like, if you're taking your feelings and your frustrations out on them, they're not going to know how to handle that. And it's not necessarily a good way to get that back up, like to communicate those thoughts and feelings to the pastor himself. So I would say, try to find a healthy space to resolve that conflict at the church, away from their home. One of the things that was hard too, as a kid, is just that like, I think people don't necessarily, especially like in a parsonage setting, like respect of like, hey, there should be some off hours here. We're not on all the time, and like I said, I know crises happen day and night, but it was, I remember like there were times when we started a church and the parsonage was a little further removed from the church. And that was just a blessing that we weren't like next door and, like kind of
Mm-hmm.
insight of just we're able to get away, and one of the things I was going to say is like, as an adult, like I find church to be a very, spiritually filling, relaxing place. But as a kid, like I kind of felt like a job sometimes, like that we had to be on, and like kids feel that pressure too of having to put on a good face, for a job that's not really theirs.
Thank you, John. Thanks for sharing. Just it's just great to see, the what you've experienced and how you've seen God's hand blessing you in the good times and like you said, the dark times. That you see benefits and blessings in all those seasons. So thank you for everything you've shared today. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks you guys. And I don't want people to think that there's any bitterness, here. I've kind of come through my own, ups and downs and struggles, with the church, but I am so glad for, the role that my father has had on my life. He's discipleship, mentor number one in my life. And I'm so happy, like your children, I consider it a blessing to have been so closely involved with the church. And it just was many, many blessings and benefits, but very happy to be here and just share anything I might know about, how to be a little more gentle to the people in your pastor's family that, are kind of catching the brunt of some things that they shouldn't.
Solid.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John, for being our guest today. Thank you for everyone for listening to our show today. We'd love to cover topics that you're looking for input on, so email us with your comments at podcast@clbforge.org. Don't forget to subscribe to our show, and we'd love it if you shared the podcast with a friend or a colleague. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
John, remember that time when we made that flaming thing at Tuscarora and we were shooting fireballs out of it?
The reason that they closed
No,
that
you should end the recording.
End it now?
End it now.
Oh,
We can
okay.
keep talking about it, but like literally end it right now.
Okay.